The Waterford crystal bowl, a wedding gift from an aunt I barely remembered, sat in the center of the dining room table, empty. It was meant for festive things, floating gardenias, polished apples, potpourri. Tonight, it held only the sterile echo of my children's voices. They were discussing my future, as if I were a piece of cumbersome furniture they had inherited. Mark, my son, all pragmatism and impatience, tapped his pen on a glossy brochure for a place called Golden Meadows. The name itself felt like an insult, a gilded cage for the gently expiring. Sarah, my daughter, practiced her particular brand of sympathetic tyranny, her voice soft with concern that felt as sharp as a shard of glass. "It's for the best, Mom. You're rattling around in this big house. The upkeep, the stairs, we worry." They didn't look at me when they said it. They spoke to each other, across the polished mahogany of the table my husband, David, had cherished. I had become a subject, a logistical problem. Their words weren't aimed at my ears but at the space I occupied, a space they were determined to clear. Mark flipped a page. "This one has a full-time nursing staff and organized activities. Bridge, watercolors, you've always been artistic, Mom." I had not picked up a paintbrush in 40 years. The last time I'd mentioned it, he'd been a boy, complaining that the smell of turpentine gave him a headache. I had packed the oils away that same day. It was just one of the 1,000 small surrenders that had become the architecture of my life. I sat at the head of the table, the matriarch in title only, and felt myself shrinking. The humiliation was not a hot flush of anger, but a cold, creeping paralysis. It was in the way Mark angled his body away from me, the way Sarah's pitying gaze slid past my face to land on a water stain on the ceiling she'd been meaning to have fixed for me. "We can get a realtor in by next week," Mark continued, his voice crisp with the satisfaction of a problem solved. "Get the place staged. It'll sell quickly in this market, my home. Not a house, but my home. The place where I had raised them, where the ghosts of my life walked freely through the halls." The scent of David's pipe tobacco still clung to the velvet curtains in the study. The faint pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe still tracked their heights, from toddlers to teenagers. And they were going to stage it, erase all evidence of a life lived, package it for strangers. I opened my mouth to protest, to say something, anything. But the words were stones in my throat. What would I even say? That my heart was breaking. They would call it sentimentality. That I was afraid. They would call it confusion. My silence had been my currency for so long, and I had finally spent myself into bankruptcy. The meeting, as they called it, concluded with a pat on my hand from Sarah and a brisk, "We'll handle everything, Mom," from Mark. They kissed my cheek, the scent of their expensive, busy lives momentarily filling the air, and then they were gone. The front door clicked shut, and the silence that rushed in was heavier, more profound than any that had come before. It was the sound of my own erasure. I sat at that table for a long time, the empty crystal bowl reflecting the dim light. I didn't cry. Crying felt like a performance, and the audience had left. Instead, a strange clarity began to settle in my bones, cold and hard as granite. They thought I was finished. They thought the story was over. But a life is not a house to be emptied and sold. It is a territory, and I had forgotten its borders. That night, I decided to find them again. My decision didn't arrive in a thunderclap of revelation, it was a quiet, creeping dawn. I moved through the house, my house, touching the spines of books, the cool silk of a lampshade, the worn velvet of David's armchair. Each object was a testament, a piece of evidence in the case for my own existence. I was not a ghost yet. I had been a wife, a mother, a caregiver. But who was I before that? Who was I now? The question led me to the attic, a place of dust and forgetting. It was where the past was stored, packed away in boxes and trunks. I was looking for something, though I didn't know what. A piece of myself I had misplaced. My eyes landed on my father's old Navy sea chest. It sat in the corner, a dark, heavy rectangle of wood and brass, smelling faintly of salt and cedar. He had been Chief Petty Officer William Gable, a man of rigid discipline and even more rigid silences. He was a photograph in a crisp uniform on the mantelpiece, a collection of medals in a velvet box, a litany of stories about duty and honor that David used to tell the children. But to me, he had been a presence defined by absence, even when he was in the same room. His love was a thing you inferred, like a distant star. You knew it was there, but you never truly felt its warmth. I had never opened the chest. It felt like trespassing on sacred ground. It was his, and he had been a man who valued his privacy above all else. But that night, something had shifted in me. The need to excavate my own life felt more pressing than the need to respect the privacy of the dead. The brass latches were stiff. They groaned in protest as I worked them open. The lid lifted with a sigh of displaced air, releasing the scent of old paper, mothballs, and something else, the faint, clean smell of the ocean. Inside, it was exactly as I'd expected. His dress whites, folded with military precision. His logbooks, the entries all technical, all business. Photographs of ships whose names I didn't know. It was a perfectly curated museum of a man I had known, yet not known at all. I ran my fingers over the stiff, starched collar of his uniform. This fabric was the armor he wore against the world, against his own family. It was what kept him separate, contained. I felt a familiar pang of childish longing, the desire to have known the man inside the uniform. I began to lift things out, carefully at first, then with more purpose. I was searching for a clue, a crack in the facade. Underneath a stack of old naval charts, my fingers brushed against a loose floorboard inside the chest. It was subtle, a slight give where there should have been none. My heart gave a little skip. Using my fingernail, I pried at the edge. The small, rectangular piece of wood lifted away, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment. It was the kind of secret space a man like my father would build, clever, practical, and utterly invisible. And inside, lying on a bed of faded blue felt, was a single, folded piece of paper. It was a receipt. Not from a store or for a military purchase. It was from a bank I had never heard of, in a small coastal town in Maine called Port Blossom. It was a receipt for the annual rental of a safe deposit box. The first date on the paper was from 50 years ago. The last renewal was just 6 months before he died. For 5 decades, my father, a man who accounted for every penny and every hour, had maintained a secret. A small, quiet, and persistent secret in a town hundreds of miles away. A place our family had never been, never even heard mentioned. The receipt was thin and fragile in my hand, but it felt as heavy as an anchor. It was a map. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I had a destination. The drive to Port Blossom was a quiet rebellion. I packed a small overnight bag, left a vague note on the kitchen counter about visiting an old friend, and slipped out of my own life before the sun was fully up. The note was a lie, of course, but it was a necessary one. My children, in their suffocating concern, would have tried to stop me. They would have called it a symptom of my decline, a sign of confusion. They wouldn't have understood that this journey was the first truly lucid thing I had done in years. The hum of the engine was a steady companion, the miles scrolling by on the odometer like beads on a rosary. With each one, the suffocating weight of my life in that house, the life they had planned for me, began to recede. I thought about my father. I tried to overlay the man I knew, stern, remote, smelling of starch and old spice, onto this new, mysterious map. What could he have possibly kept in a bank box so far from home? The obvious, sordid answers flickered through my mind, a secret affair, a hidden child. But they didn't feel right. My father's flaw wasn't passion, it was the lack of it. He was a man who seemed to have cauterized his own emotions in the name of duty. A secret life felt too messy, too human for him. I remembered him on his last shore leave before he retired. I was a young woman then, already married to David. Father sat in our living room, a stiff, uniformed statue, while my own life swirled around him. He watched, his eyes a pale, assessing blue, but he never seemed to be a part of it. I'd tried to draw him in, asking about his travels. He would offer only curt, factual summaries. The Mediterranean was calm. The work was necessary, there was no romance, no adventure, only the flat recitation of duty performed. My mother had learned to navigate his silences, to build a life in the spaces he left empty. I see now that I had learned the same skill. I had become an expert at interpreting the unsaid, at managing the emotional temperature of a room, at making myself smaller to accommodate the silent gravity of the men in my life. First my father, then David. They were good men, honorable men. But their love was a fortress, and I had always lived on the outside of the walls. Port Blossom was exactly what its name suggested. A small, rugged town nestled in a curve of the Maine coastline, where the scent of salt and pine hung in the air like a permanent fixture. The houses were weathered cedar shake, the colors muted by years of sea spray. It was a place that felt real, unvarnished. The bank was a sturdy granite building on the corner of the main street, looking as though it had been there since the town was founded. I walked in, the little bell over the door announcing my arrival. My hands trembled slightly as I approached the teller. I felt like an imposter, a spy infiltrating a foreign country. I presented the old receipt, my father's death certificate, and my own identification. The bank manager, a kind-faced woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, looked at the documents with a gentle curiosity. "William Gable," she said, her voice soft. "Of course. He was a good friend to this town." My breath caught. A good friend. My father had no friends that I knew of, only colleagues and subordinates. She led me back to the vault, a massive steel door that swung open with a satisfyingly heavy thud. The air inside was cool and still. She retrieved the box, number 317, and placed it on a small table in a private viewing room, leaving me with a quiet, "Take all the time you need, dear." The box was cold and heavy in my hands. It felt like a coffin, holding the remains of a man I never knew. I lifted the lid. There was no gold, no cash, no evidence of a hidden fortune in the traditional sense. Instead, it was filled with paper. On top lay a neat stack of letters tied with a simple black ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was elegant, feminine. My heart sank. So, it was an affair after all. But as I opened the first letter, I realized I was wrong. The salutation was "Dear Will," and the signature was "Yours in scholarship, Elspeth." The letters were not from a lover. They were from a woman named Elspeth Finch, a local historian. They spanned nearly 50 years, a long and detailed correspondence about the history of Port Blossom, about maritime trade routes, about the preservation of the town's small, struggling library. They were letters between two minds, two intellects that had found a rare and profound connection. My father's replies were there too, carbon copies, typed on thin, translucent paper. In his letters, he was a different man. He was witty, passionate, full of ideas and opinions on literature, on history, on the importance of preserving the stories of ordinary people. He wrote of his frustration with the rigid structure of the Navy, his secret love for poetry, his dream of one day retiring to a quiet place where he could simply read and think. He was alive in those pages in a way he had never been with us. Beneath the letters were documents. Deeds to several small properties in the town, including the building that housed the library. Financial statements for a modest but cleverly managed investment portfolio, with all the dividends directed into a trust for the town's historical society. There was a last will and testament, separate from the one he'd left for our family, bequeathing these assets to the town of Port Blossom upon his death. But there was a codicil, added in the last year of his life. It stated that in the event of his death, full control and ownership of all the Port Blossom assets would pass not to the town, but directly to his daughter, Eleanor Gable. Me. He had left me a kingdom I never knew existed. And more than that, he had left me his secret self. Sitting in that sterile, silent viewing room, the truth settled over me not as a betrayal, but as a profound and aching revelation. My father hadn't been having an affair of the flesh, but an affair of the soul. He had built a second life, a parallel existence, where he could be the man he was never allowed to be in his uniform or in our home. Will, not William. A scholar, a benefactor, a friend. A man who discussed poetry with a woman who understood him. He wasn't a cold, unfeeling man. He was a man in a cage. And he had spent his life quietly, secretly tending to a garden of his own, a place where his true self could breathe. I saw, with a clarity that felt like a physical blow, how I had built a cage for myself as well. The cage of being a good wife, a dutiful mother, a quiet and accommodating woman. The cage of my children's expectations. I had tended to everyone else's garden for so long that I had forgotten I was even capable of planting my own. The grief I felt was not for a secret love affair, but for the years he and I had lost. The conversations we never had. The man I never got to know. He had been just as trapped as I was, in his own way. And in his final act, he hadn't just left me money and property. He had left me a key. A way out. I didn't cry. I folded the letters, placed the documents back in their neat stacks, and closed the lid of the box. I walked out of that vault and into the salty Maine air, and for the first time, I felt the wind on my own terms. The bank manager had been right. He had been a friend to this town. But his final act of friendship, it seemed, was reserved for me. My first call was not to my children, but to the lawyer whose name was on the codicil. His name was Arthur Vance, a local man with a gentle, reassuring voice. He remembered my father well. "Your father was a remarkable man, Mrs. Peters," he said, using my married name. "He loved this place. He believed in preserving history, in giving people a chance to learn. He said it was the only real legacy." We spoke for an hour. He explained the portfolio, the properties, the trust. It was all real, all legally mine. It wasn't a fortune that would make headlines, but it was substantial. It was enough. It was freedom. When I hung up the phone, the world felt different. The air was sharper, the colors of the sea and sky more vivid. I was not Eleanor Peters, the widow, the mother, the problem to be managed. I was Eleanor Gable, the daughter of a secret scholar, the inheritor of a hidden legacy. I stayed in Port Blossom for 3 days. I walked the narrow streets, visited the library my father had saved, and ran my hand over the brass plaque by the door that read, "In memory of the sailors who loved the sea, and the stories it holds." I found Elspeth Finch's name on the spine of a local history book. I learned she had passed away a few years before my father. Theirs was a story contained entirely in those letters, a friendship of the mind that had left a physical, lasting mark on this town. This quiet, beautiful place was his true home. And maybe it could be mine too. When I returned to my house, the house my children were so eager to sell, it looked different. It was no longer a sanctuary of memories, but a museum of a life that was no longer mine. The furniture, the photographs, the suffocating silence, it was all part of the cage. And I now held the key. I began to pack, but not in the way my children envisioned. I didn't sort things into boxes for keep, donate, and trash. Instead, I moved through the rooms with a new purpose. I was an archaeologist of my own life, excavating the artifacts that truly mattered. I packed the books David had loved, the single photograph of my parents where my father was almost smiling, the small, imperfect clay pinch pot my granddaughter Lily had made for me in kindergarten. Everything else was just stuff. Things that had owned me, not the other way around. My granddaughter Lily arrived one afternoon, unannounced as she often did. She was 17, with an artist's soul, and eyes that saw more than most. She found me in the study, surrounded by boxes. Unlike her father and her aunt, she didn't see a confused old woman. She saw a plan. "Grandma? What's going on?" she asked, her voice free of the condescending pity I had grown so used to. She looked at the boxes, at the determined set of my jaw, and a slow smile spread across her face. "Are you running away?" I laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt rusty from disuse. "Something like that," I said. "I'm running towards something." I didn't tell her everything. Not about the money or the secret life. But I told her about Port Blossom. I told her about the library, and about the feeling of the sea air on my face. I told her I was going to find a new place to live, a place that was just for me. She didn't question me. She didn't tell me I was being irrational. She simply sat on the floor, picked up a roll of packing tape and said, "Okay. Where do we start?" For the next week, Lily was my silent, steadfast ally. She helped me wrap fragile things, label boxes, and sort through decades of accumulated life. We worked in a comfortable silence, punctuated by shared stories. She was the one person who wasn't trying to write my final chapter for me. She was content to just help me turn the page. It was Lily who was there when I made the second call to a realtor. Not the one Mark had chosen, a slick man in a suit who talked about maximizing market value, but a woman Lily knew, a friend of her art teacher, who spoke about finding a home, the right new family. When she came to the house, she looked at me, not at the square footage. "It's a beautiful home," she said. "It's been well loved." I knew then she was the right choice. My systematic dismantling of my old life was quiet, methodical, and went completely unnoticed by the two people who thought they were in charge of it. The family meeting was their idea, of course. Mark called it Operation Mom, Phase 2. The name alone told me everything I needed to know about how they saw me, as a project to be managed, a problem with a multi-step solution. They arrived on a Sunday afternoon, bearing the armor of their good intentions. Sarah had a casserole, as if a warm meal could soften the blow of being forcibly displaced. Mark had a leather-bound folder containing spreadsheets and comparisons of the assisted living facilities. They sat at the dining room table, in the exact same spots they had occupied weeks before, the empty crystal bowl once again bearing silent witness. I had prepared. The house was tidier than it had been in years, but subtly so. The personal clutter, the little things that made it a home, were gone, packed away in the boxes now stored neatly in the garage. To a casual observer, the house was simply clean. To me, it was already a shell. They began their presentation. Mark clicked his pen and launched into a speech about fiscal responsibility and long-term care. He used phrases like asset liquidation and proactive planning. He was talking about my life as if it were a corporate merger. Sarah chimed in with the emotional ammunition, talking about how much easier it would be for everyone, how I wouldn't have to worry about a thing, how they could visit me every weekend. The unspoken part of that sentence, instead of having to maintain this big, old house for you, hung in the air between us. I let them talk. I listened with a serene, unnerving calm that I had never possessed before. I watched their faces, saw the conviction in their eyes. They truly believed they were doing the right thing, the sensible thing. They had written me out of my own story so completely that they couldn't even see me sitting right in front of them, the main character, silently preparing for a plot twist they could never have imagined. I didn't fidget. I didn't interrupt. I let the full weight of their plans, their assumptions, their gentle, loving tyranny settle in the room. I let them build their case against my life, brick by well-intentioned brick. When they finally wound down, they looked at me, expecting tears or arguments, or at the very least, a weary resignation. It was the moment for my quiet surrender. Mark slid a brochure for Golden Meadows across the table toward me. "So, Mom," he said, his voice softening into what he thought was a tone of gentle persuasion. "What do you think?" "It's the best option, really." I looked at the glossy photo of smiling, silver-haired seniors playing shuffleboard. I looked at my son, so confident and so blind. I looked at my daughter, her face a mask of loving concern. And then I spoke. My voice was quiet, but it filled the silent room. "It's a lovely brochure," I said, my tone even. "But it's not necessary." Sarah frowned. "Mom, we have to do something. We can't just let you." I held up a hand, a small, simple gesture that stopped her mid-sentence. "I've already done something," I said. I let the silence stretch for a moment, savoring the first flicker of confusion in their eyes. "The house," I said, my gaze steady. "It's been sold." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. It wasn't empty. It was heavy, charged with disbelief and a dawning, horrified comprehension. Mark was the first to speak, his voice sharp, accusatory. What are you talking about? Sold to who? You can't have. Did someone take advantage of you? Did you sign something you shouldn't have? Sarah's face crumpled with a different kind of alarm. Oh, Mommy, no. Who came to the door? We told you not to talk to strangers. They saw me as a victim, a fool, an incompetent old woman who had been tricked out of her own home. The thought that I might have acted on my own volition, with my own mind, was so far outside their realm of possibility that it didn't even occur to them. No one took advantage of me, I said calmly. I rose from my chair and went to the sideboard. I retrieved a simple manila folder and returned to the table. I laid it down in the center, next to their brochures and spreadsheets. I sold it myself. The closing was last Friday. I opened the folder. Inside was a copy of the signed sales agreement, the settlement statement, and the deed to a small cottage in Port Blossom, Maine. Paid for in full. Mark stared at the papers, his face a mask of stunned fury. How? Why? Why wouldn't you tell us? Because, I said, my voice still quiet but now infused with a strength that came from a place they had never known existed, you weren't asking for my opinion. You were giving me my orders. I then told them everything. I told them about their grandfather's sea chest, about the hidden compartment, about the receipt. I told them about Port Blossom, about the library, about the letters. I didn't tell them with anger or resentment. I told the story as a simple fact, a history they had been ignorant of. I explained that my father, the man they remembered as a rigid disciplinarian, had a secret life of the mind, a place of passion and intellect he had kept hidden from the world. He built a life where he could be himself, I said, looking from my son's face to my daughter's. And he left me the key to it. He left me a choice. I slid another document across the table. It was a summary of the investment portfolio now in my name. It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact. A declaration of independence. You saw me as a liability, I said, my voice finally trembling, not with weakness, but with the force of 50 years of unspoken truth. An obligation. A problem to be managed. You were so busy planning my final days that you never stopped to consider that I might want to live them. Sarah began to cry, but her tears held no power over me anymore. Mark just stared, his mouth slightly agape, the architect of a plan whose foundations had just crumbled into dust. They had come to dismantle my life, only to find I had already packed it up and shipped it to a new address. The power they had held over me, the power of my dependence and my silence, was gone. It had vanished into the salt air of a town they had never heard of. I stood up. I'll be leaving in the morning, I said. The new owners will be here next week. I've left the keys on the kitchen counter, and with that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them with the ruins of their good intentions. The aftermath was not loud. There were no more angry phone calls, no dramatic confrontations. There was only a thick, wounded silence from my children. They had been rendered speechless, not by my anger but by my competence. They didn't know how to fight a woman who no longer needed their approval, their help or their pity. My departure was quiet and simple. Lily came over early in the morning to say goodbye. She hugged me tightly, her embrace fierce and proud. "Send me pictures of the ocean, Grandma," she whispered. "I will," I promised. I drove away from that house without a single look in the rearview mirror. The life contained within its walls was no longer my story. It was the prologue. My car was packed with only what mattered, a few boxes of books and memories, and a safe deposit box key that felt warm in my pocket. The cottage in Port Blossom was small and perfect, smelling of cedar and sea salt. It had a wide porch that looked out over the water and a small, wild garden that needed tending. For the first few weeks, I did nothing but sit on that porch and breathe. I watched the tides come in and go out. I watched the lobster boats chug out of the harbor at dawn. The silence here was different. It wasn't an absence of sound, it was a presence. It was the gentle lap of waves, the cry of a gull, the whisper of wind through the pines. It was the sound of peace. I found a community not in organized activities, but in the simple rhythms of the town. I introduced myself at the library, and the librarian's eyes lit up when I said my father's name. I met people who knew him not as a stern officer, but as the quiet, generous man who had saved their town's history. Through their stories, I was meeting my father for the first time. I began to understand his secret, not as a rejection of us, but as an act of self-preservation. He had given his life to duty, to his country, to his family. But he had kept one small corner of his soul for himself. And in the end, he had passed that sacred space on to me. I started painting again. I set up an easel on the porch and painted the ocean in its 100 different moods. My hands were stiff at first, my eye uncertain. But slowly, it came back to me. The joy of mixing colors, the satisfaction of a clean line, the magic of capturing a moment of light on canvas. I wasn't painting for anyone else. I wasn't trying to be artistic. I was simply doing something that brought me joy. I was tending my own garden. My son, Mark, called once. His voice was strained, formal. He asked if I was settled. I said I was. He didn't know what else to say. The old dynamic was broken, and we didn't have the language for a new one yet. Sarah sent a card with a picture of her family, a carefully worded note about hoping I was well. I knew it was their way of reaching out, but I also knew that the healing, if it was to come, would have to be on new terms. It would be on my terms. I think about the woman I was, sitting at that dining room table, shrinking under the weight of my children's plans. She seems like a distant ancestor, a ghost from another life. Humiliation was the catalyst, the cold, hard slap that woke me from a long slumber. But it was my father's secret that gave me the map. He showed me that you can live a life of duty, and still keep a part of yourself sacred. He showed me that it's never too late to claim your own territory. Sometimes, the people we think we know best are strangers to us. We see them only in the roles they play in our own lives: mother, father, wife, husband. We forget that behind the role is a person, with a history, with secret dreams, with a soul that might be quietly starving for air. My father's secret wasn't about the money or the town. It was about the quiet, desperate human need to be truly seen. In finding his hidden life, I finally found my own. And so, if you feel invisible, if you feel that your story has already been written by others, I want you to know this: look for the hidden compartments. They are there. In the back of a closet, in the pages of an old book, in the quiet corners of your own heart. There is a key. There is a map. And the journey to a new shore can begin at any age. All it takes is the quiet decision to turn the page, to pack the car, and to drive toward the sound of the ocean, toward the person you were always meant to be.